32 hours. That's how long Victoria Hale had been screaming in labor while 20 doctors stood helpless. The wife of a decorated Marine general was about to lose everything. Her twins, maybe her life. Every specialist in that Louisiana hospital had given up. They were prepping for emergency surgery when a 25-year-old nurse, mocked, dismissed, treated like she was invisible, stepped forward and said two words that froze the room. "I can." What happened in the next 20 minutes would make doctors question everything they knew and turn a rookie into a legend. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's private hospital hummed with that sterile, eternal brightness that made it impossible to tell if it was dawn or midnight. In the quiet corridor of the maternity wing, a young woman stood at the supply cart, her hands trembling slightly as she counted gauze pads for the third time. 25-year-old Naomi Graham wore her nervousness like an ill-fitting coat, constantly adjusting, constantly aware of how visible she felt, and yet how invisible she truly was. It was only her first week on the job, and already she could feel the weight of every glance, every dismissive smile, every condescending pat on the shoulder that came with being the rookie in a place where experience was currency and newcomers were little more than furniture that occasionally needed to be reminded to move out of the way. "Can you handle this, rookie?" The voice belonged to Brenda, a senior nurse with 20 years under her belt and a face that seemed permanently arranged into an expression of mild irritation. She thrust a clipboard toward Naomi without making eye contact, already turning away before Naomi could respond. It wasn't a real question. It was a test disguised as delegation. A small, daily reminder that Naomi hadn't earned her place yet, hadn't proven she belonged in these halls where decisions were made by people with titles, seniority, and the kind of confidence that comes from years of knowing exactly how things are supposed to be done. Naomi took the clipboard and nodded, even though Brenda was already halfway down the hall. She double-checked the medication orders, cross-referenced the patient names, verified the dosages with the same meticulous care her mother had taught her. Measure twice, act once. But when she brought her notes to the medication briefing, the charge nurse glanced at her work and smiled, that particular smile that manages to be both polite and cutting at the same time. "We've already handled this, sweetheart. Maybe next time check in before you duplicate work, Two of the other nurses exchanged knowing looks. One of them rolled her eyes so subtly that if Naomi hadn't been watching, hadn't been hyper-aware of every micro-expression directed her way, she might have missed it. She wanted to explain that she hadn't been told about the briefing, that no one had mentioned they were handling the medication orders, that she was only trying to be thorough, trying to be helpful, trying to prove that she deserved to be here. But the words caught in her throat the way they always did when she felt small, and she simply nodded, murmured an apology that tasted like failure, and stepped back into her designated role, the rookie who tries too hard and still somehow never does enough. The hours blurred together in a rhythm of small humiliations and smaller victories. She organized supply closets that no one thanked her for organizing. She asked questions that were met with sighs and abbreviated answers, as if her need to understand was an inconvenience rather than a sign of someone who cared about getting things right. She offered to help with patient rounds and was told, with a patronizing gentleness that felt worse than outright rejection, "Why don't you observe for now? We'll let you know when we need you." So she observed. She watched the senior staff move through the ward with practiced efficiency, their authority unquestioned, their decisions final. She stood at the edges of rooms during consultations, her name tag, still blank except for Graham, RN, feeling like a badge of inadequacy. And when the shift finally broke for a late dinner, Naomi found herself alone in the break room, surrounded by the ghosts of conversations she hadn't been invited to join. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened her photos, scrolling past recent images until she found the one she'd been carrying with her since nursing school. It was old, faded at the edges, the colors slightly washed out the way photographs from the 1980s always seemed to be. In it, her grandmother stood in the doorway of their small Louisiana home, her dark hands cradling a newborn wrapped in a homemade blanket. The mother sat beside her, exhausted and glowing, her face full of the kind of joy that only comes after impossible pain has been transformed into impossible love. Naomi had been 8 years old when she took that photo with her mother's disposable camera, and she remembered the feeling in that room, the sacred quiet, The trust, the way her grandmother's hands had moved with absolute certainty, as if guided by something deeper than training, something older than textbooks. She touched the screen gently, tracing the outline of her grandmother's face, and whispered to the empty break room, to the memory, to herself, "I know what I know." Little did the staff of St. Catherine's Hospital realize that this soft-spoken rookie they'd spent a week dismissing was carrying a secret in her hands and her heart. Wisdom passed down through generations, knowledge earned not in classrooms, but in kitchens and bedrooms and small homes where women brought life into the world with nothing but courage, patience, and trust in the body's ancient intelligence. Little did they know that before the sun rose again, Naomi Graham would do something that would make them question everything they thought they knew about medicine, about authority, and about who really deserves to be heard. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been the person in the room that everyone overlooks, you'll want to stay for what happens next. Because this story gets powerful. And it starts with a scream that would change everything. The scream tore through the maternity wing like something primal and desperate, shattering the sterile calm that had settled over St. Catherine's Hospital. It was the kind of sound that made everyone stop. Nurses mid-sentence, doctors mid-stride, even Naomi, still sitting in the break room with her grandmother's photo on her phone screen. It wasn't the controlled breathing of managed labor or the anticipated cries of active delivery. This was the sound of a woman at the absolute edge of her endurance, a plea wrapped in agony, echoing down corridors designed to muffle such raw humanity. Naomi stood quickly, her heart already racing, and moved toward the source of the sound. Other staff were converging from different directions, their faces tight with concern. Through the chaos of hurried footsteps and urgent voices, she caught fragments of conversation. Victoria Hale, 32 hours, twins, complications. Victoria Hale. The name carried weight in this hospital, not because of who she was, but because of who her husband was. General Marcus Hale, decorated Marine Corps officer, a man who'd commanded battalions and survived tours in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. And now his wife, his partner of 20 years, was fighting a battle that no amount of military strategy could help her win. Victoria was in her early 40s, and after 2 decades of hoping, praying, and enduring loss after loss, she'd finally gotten pregnant. Naturally, miraculously, with twin boys. The pregnancy everyone had called impossible had happened. But now, 32 hours into labor, that miracle was turning into a nightmare. The doors to delivery room 3 burst open and Dr. Raymond Morrison strode out, his face grave, his surgical cap already in place. He was followed closely by Dr. Linda Chun and Dr. Baptiste, 3 of the most respected obstetricians in the South, specialists who'd been flown in from across the region because this case was too important, too high profile, too precarious to leave to anyone but the best. They moved with the practiced urgency of people who'd seen every complication, handled every crisis, and yet the tension in their shoulders, the tight set of their jaws, told a different story. This was bad. I need in or prepped immediately, Dr. Morrison said to the charge nurse, his voice clipped and professional, but edged with something Naomi recognized as barely controlled alarm. Full surgical team. We're looking at emergency C-section, possibly crash protocol if those heart rates don't stabilize. Dr. Chun emerged next, peeling off her gloves. 32 hours, Ray. She's beyond exhausted. Contractions are irregular. Babies are showing signs of distress. Baby A's heart rate dropped to 95 twice in the last 20 minutes. Baby B isn't much better. She's been pushing for 6 hours, Dr. Baptiste added, his French Creole accent thickening with stress. We've tried every position, every intervention. Pitocin, amniotomy, manual rotation. Nothing is progressing. The cervix is complete, but those babies aren't descending. If we wait any longer, we're not just risking the twins, we're risking her too. What had started as a routine delivery, if any twin birth could be called routine, had become a nightmare. And as the doctors conferred in hushed, urgent tones just outside the delivery room door, it was about to get worse. Dr. Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a verdict. We're out of options. Prep for emergency C-section. We have maybe an hour before we lose them both. Maybe less. He looked at his colleagues, and for a moment, the mask of professional confidence slipped just enough to reveal the human underneath. A doctor who knew he was running out of time, out of answers, and out of miracles. Naomi stood frozen in the hallway, far enough away that none of the doctors noticed her, close enough that every word landed like a stone in her chest. She watched them disappear back into the delivery room, heard Victoria's exhausted sobs, heard the beeping of fetal monitors that seemed to be counting down rather than keeping time. And something in Naomi's mind shifted, pulled her backward across time and space to a memory she hadn't thought about in years. She was 8 years old again, standing in Mrs. Delacroix's small kitchen in rural Louisiana. It was 3 in the morning, and her mother had woken her gently, whispered that they were needed, that a baby was coming and couldn't wait for the 30-mile drive to the nearest hospital. Naomi remembered the steam rising from the pot of boiling water, the clean sheets her mother had brought, and her grandmother, Grandma Louise, standing at the bedside with her weathered hands resting gently on Mrs. Delacroix's swollen belly. There were no monitors, no medical degrees hanging on the wall, no team of specialists. Just 3 generations of women, candlelight, and an unshakable trust in the wisdom of the body. Her grandmother's voice came back to her as clearly as if the woman were standing beside her in that hospital corridor. The body knows the way, baby girl. You just gotta listen. Don't rush it. Don't force it. Feel the rhythm. Trust the mama. Trust the baby. They've been doing this dance since the beginning of time, and they know the steps better than any doctor ever will. Naomi had watched, silent and reverent, as her grandmother guided Mrs. Delacroix through hour after hour of labor. No panic. No rushing. Just patience, presence, and hands that seemed to know exactly where to press, when to wait, when to encourage. And when that baby finally came, slippery and screaming and perfect, Naomi had seen something she'd never forget. The absolute certainty that women's bodies, when trusted and supported, knew how to bring life into the world. She'd watched her grandmother do it 23 times over the years. Home births, all of them. No hospitals. No interventions. And not a single loss. Not one mother. Not one baby. The memory faded and Naomi was back in the present, standing in the hallway of St. Catherine's Hospital, staring at the closed door of Delivery Room 3. Inside, the best doctors in the South were preparing to cut a woman open because they'd run out of options. But Naomi's instincts, those same instincts her grandmother had nurtured in that Louisiana kitchen, were screaming that something was wrong with their approach. That maybe, just maybe, the answer wasn't in a scalpel. That maybe the body did know the way, if only someone would listen. Naomi moved closer to the window of Delivery Room 3, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Through the glass, she could see Victoria Hale on the bed, her body glistening with sweat, her face contorted not just with pain, but with a kind of desperate exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle for too long without rest. The monitors beeped their relentless rhythm, numbers flashing, lines spiking and falling. Dr. Morrison and Dr. Chen stood on either side of the bed, their attention fixed on the screens, on the data, on everything except the woman herself. But Naomi wasn't looking at the monitors. She was watching Victoria's body, the way her abdomen tightened and released, the timing of her breathing, the tension in her shoulders and hips. And she saw it, a pattern the doctors had missed. Victoria's contractions were strong, regular even, coming every 2 to 3 minutes with the kind of intensity that should have been moving those babies down the birth canal. But Victoria was fighting them. Every time a contraction began, she tensed her entire body, held her breath, pushed against the wave instead of riding it. She was exhausted, yes, but more than that, she was working against her own body's natural rhythm, and no amount of medical intervention was going to fix that. The problem wasn't mechanical. It was communication. Victoria's body was trying to tell her something, and she was too tired, too scared, too overwhelmed to hear it. Naomi's grandmother's voice echoed in her mind again. When a mama fights the pain, she fights the baby. You gotta teach her to let go, to trust, to move with it, not against it. She knew what needed to be done. She could see it as clearly as if her grandmother were standing beside her, pointing it out. A shift in position. A change in breathing technique. Someone to guide Victoria back into sync with her own body's wisdom. It wouldn't take surgery. It wouldn't take an hour. It might only take 20 minutes if someone would just listen. Naomi took a breath, steadied herself, and walked toward the delivery room door. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was solid. She reached for the handle just as Dr. Morrison emerged, nearly colliding with her. He looked down at her with barely concealed impatience. already moving past her toward the surgical prep area. "Dr. Morrison," Naomi said, her voice quieter than she intended but clear enough to make him pause. "May I suggest? We don't have time for training exercises, Graham." His words were sharp, dismissive, delivered without even the courtesy of eye contact. He kept walking, already pulling his phone out to call the anesthesiologist, his mind 3 steps ahead and completely uninterested in whatever a first-week nurse might have to say. Naomi stood frozen, her suggestion dying in her throat. Around her, other nurses had stopped what they were doing, and she could feel their eyes on her, some pitying, some embarrassed on her behalf, others annoyed that she'd even tried. Brenda, the senior nurse who'd questioned her competence earlier, shook her head slowly, a warning written clearly on her face. "Don't embarrass yourself." Another nurse, Clara, older and somewhat kinder, stepped closer and touched Naomi's shoulder with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for children who don't understand why they can't have dessert before dinner. "Honey, you're new," she said softly, as if explaining a difficult truth. "Let the experts handle this. Dr. Morrison and Dr. Chun have delivered over 3,000 babies between them. They know what they're doing. You'll learn in time, but right now, the best thing you can do is step back and observe." The words were meant to be comforting, but they landed like stones. Step back. Observe. Stay in your lane. Know your place. Naomi felt tears stinging the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from frustration so intense it felt physical. She nodded to Clara, managed something that might have resembled a smile, and backed away from the delivery room door. But Naomi saw something the doctors couldn't, or wouldn't, or had been trained not to see in their years of medical school and residency and board certifications. She saw a woman whose body knew exactly what to do, if only someone would help her listen to it instead of overriding it with protocols and procedures and panic. And she knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic, that if she didn't speak now, if she didn't find a way to make someone hear her, 2 innocent lives would be lost forever. Maybe 3. She retreated to the hallway, pressing her back against the cool wall, her mind racing. The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over, hot and furious. She wiped them away quickly, ashamed of her own emotion in a place that seemed to value detachment and clinical precision above all else. Through the window, she could see the surgical team assembling, the instruments being laid out with metallic precision, Victoria being prepped for an operation she might not survive in her current state of exhaustion. Clara's words echoed in Naomi's head. "Let the experts handle this." But another voice, quieter but more insistent, rose up from some place deep in her chest. A voice that sounded like her grandmother, like her mother, like every woman who'd ever trusted her hands and her instincts in the face of impossible odds. But what if the experts are wrong? The question hung in the air around her, unanswered and dangerous. Because to believe that the experts were wrong meant believing that she, a 25-year-old nurse with 1 week of experience at this hospital, might be right. It meant trusting herself more than she trusted degrees and credentials and the entire hierarchical structure of modern medicine. It meant risking everything, her job, her reputation, her future, on the chance that generations of wisdom passed down through kitchen tables and small bedrooms in rural Louisiana might know something that 3,000 successful deliveries had somehow forgotten. Naomi looked down at her hands, steady now, no longer trembling, and thought of her grandmother's hands. The same hands, the same knowledge flowing through them like blood through veins, like memory through generations. And in that moment, standing alone in a hospital hallway while a woman and her babies ran out of time, Naomi Graham made a decision that would change everything. She didn't know yet how she would do it, or what it would cost her, but she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't let this happen. She couldn't stand by and watch the experts fail when she knew there was another way. The question was no longer whether she was right. The question was whether anyone would let her prove it. In the family waiting room at the end of the maternity wing, a man sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders curved inward in a posture of defeat that seemed impossible for someone of his stature. General Marcus Hale was 53 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of disciplined muscle and bearing, with silver threading through his dark hair and a chest full of medals earned in places most people only saw on news broadcasts. He'd commanded battalions through desert warfare, made split-second decisions that saved lives and ended others, stood firm under enemy fire, and earned the respect of every soldier who'd ever served under him. But sitting in that waiting room, listening to his wife's screams echoing down the hallway, he'd never felt more powerless in his entire life. 20 years. That's how long they'd been trying. Victoria had been 22 when they married, young and full of hope, dreaming of a house full of children and Sunday mornings thick with laughter. Marcus had just made captain, and the world felt wide open with possibility. They'd started trying right away, the way young couples do when they believe biology is on their side and miracles are just a matter of time. But the miracle never came. Month after month, year after year, the answer was always the same. Not this time. Not yet. Maybe next month. The losses had been brutal. 3 miscarriages before the 12th week. One at 18 weeks that nearly broke Victoria completely. A little girl they'd already named Sarah, whose nursery Victoria had spent weeks painting in soft lavender. Then years of fertility treatments, injections that left bruises on Victoria's stomach, procedures that turned intimacy into clinical obligation, hope that curdled into grief with every negative test. The doctors had been kind but increasingly blunt. At her age, with her history, the chances were minimal. Maybe it was time to consider other options. Adoption, surrogacy, acceptance. But Victoria wouldn't accept it. Couldn't. And Marcus, who'd led men through impossible missions, couldn't bring himself to tell his wife to give up on the only mission that truly mattered to her. So they kept trying, kept hoping, even as the years turned their shared dream into a shared wound. And then, impossibly, miraculously, at 42 years old, Victoria had gotten pregnant. Naturally. No treatments, no interventions. Just 2 exhausted people who'd stopped trying so hard and somehow stumbled into grace. When the ultrasound revealed twins, 2 boys, healthy and strong, Victoria had wept so hard the technician had to pause the examination. Marcus, who hadn't cried since his father's funeral 15 years earlier, felt tears streaming down his face in that darkened exam room, his hand gripping Victoria's so tightly he was afraid he might hurt her. This was their miracle. After 2 decades of loss and grief and hope deferred until it felt like mockery, this was their second chance at everything they'd ever wanted. And now he might lose all of it in one terrible night. Marcus pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes, trying to shut out the sound of Victoria's screams, trying to pray but finding the words tangled and useless. He'd faced enemy combatants, IEDs, mortar fire, and political minefields, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this kind of fear. The fear of standing by while the person you love most in the world suffers beyond your ability to help. The fear of watching doctors with grave faces huddle in urgent conversation. The fear that the miracle you'd waited 20 years for might be ripped away just as you finally held it in your hands. He stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer, and walked toward the delivery wing. He knew he wasn't supposed to be there, that family members were meant to wait patiently in designated areas. But he was a general, and he'd never been good at following rules that didn't make sense. He needed to see her, needed to see what was happening, needed to do something, anything, other than sit in that room listening to his wife scream while strangers made decisions about her life. He reached the window of delivery room 3 and looked inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Victoria looked small on that bed, diminished somehow, her body pushed to a limit he hadn't known existed. The doctors moved around her with controlled urgency, but Marcus, who'd spent 30 years reading body language in high-stress situations, could see it in their faces. They were worried. More than worried. They were preparing for the worst. He turned away, unable to watch any longer, and that's when he saw her. A young nurse stood alone in the hallway, maybe 20 feet away, her back against the wall. She wasn't moving, wasn't checking charts or prepping equipment like the other staff rushing past her. She was just standing there, her face tilted slightly upward, her expression caught somewhere between determination and something else Marcus recognized immediately because he'd seen it in the mirror before every major operation he'd ever led. The look of someone who knows exactly what needs to be done but isn't sure anyone will let them do it. Their eyes met across that fluorescent-lit hallway. Marcus didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her except that she looked young and out of place, and somehow utterly certain despite the chaos swirling around them. And in that moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but profound, a recognition that happens sometimes between people who've learned to trust their instincts in situations where everything is on the line. He was a soldier who'd made his career on gut feelings and split-second assessments of character. He'd learned to read people in seconds, to know who would hold the line and who would break, who had the courage to do what needed doing even when the rulebook said otherwise. And looking at this young nurse with her steady gaze and quiet intensity, Marcus Hale knew, without logic, without evidence, with only the instinct that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours, that she saw something everyone else was missing. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A soldier who'd trusted his instincts in battle and learned that sometimes the most important intelligence comes from the most unexpected sources. And a young woman who'd learned to trust hers in a Louisiana kitchen, watching her grandmother bring life into the world with nothing but patience and certainty. Neither of them knew it yet, but that eye contact would change everything. It would become the hinge on which the entire night turned. The moment when 2 strangers recognized in each other the kind of courage it takes to stand against consensus, to believe in knowledge that can't be quantified, to trust what you know even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. Marcus was still holding that gaze, still trying to understand what he was seeing in the young nurse's face, when the delivery room door burst open with enough force to make him flinch. Dr. Morrison emerged, his surgical mask pulled down, his face set in grim lines. He looked directly at Marcus with the expression doctors wear when they're about to ask you to make an impossible choice in an impossible situation. "General," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 32 hours of failed interventions and dwindling options, "we need your consent. We're taking her to surgery now." The delivery room transformed into controlled chaos in a matter of minutes. Surgical nurses appeared as if summoned, their movements precise and practiced, a choreography perfected through countless emergencies. The bed was adjusted, locks released, wheels turning as they prepared to transport Victoria Hale from the relative intimacy of the delivery room to the stark, unforgiving brightness of the operating theater. Someone draped a warmed blanket over her trembling body, more for protocol than comfort. The monitors were disconnected, reconnected to portable units, their beeping following Victoria like a countdown that everyone could hear, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Victoria herself was barely conscious, her eyes half closed, her lips moving in what might have been words or prayers, or simply the incoherent murmuring of someone who'd pushed past the limits of human endurance. "Please," she whispered, the words slurred with exhaustion. "Please, not like this." Whether she was asking for mercy, for a different outcome, or simply expressing the deep, bone-tired disappointment of a woman who'd waited 20 years to give birth naturally only to have that dream stolen by medical necessity, no one could say. But the plea hung in the air, breaking hearts that had learned long ago not to break in situations like this. General Marcus Hale stood just outside the delivery room door, a clipboard thrust into his hands by a nurse whose face showed professional sympathy, but whose eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall. Time was the enemy now, and everyone knew it. The consent forms were dense with medical terminology and legal disclaimers, paragraphs of risks and complications that all boiled down to a simple, terrible truth. His wife might not survive this. His sons might not survive this. Or he might lose all of them in one surgical procedure that had become necessary because every other option had been exhausted. His hands shook as he signed his name. General Marcus Hale, the signature he'd used to authorize military operations, to sign condolence letters to families of fallen soldiers, to approve missions that sent men into harm's way. But none of those signatures had ever felt this heavy, this final, this much like surrender. He forced his hand to stay steady enough to complete the letters of his name, but the pen trembled visibly, and the nurse who took the clipboard from him pretended not to notice. "We'll take good care of her, sir," the nurse said, the words automatic and meant to be reassuring, but landing somewhere closer to hollow. How many times had she said those exact words to how many desperate family members? And how many times had those words turned out to be promises that couldn't be kept? They wheeled Victoria past him, and Marcus reached out, his hand finding hers for just a moment. Her fingers were cold, her grip weak, and when she opened her eyes and looked at him, he saw something that terrified him more than any enemy fire ever had. He saw her giving up, saw her surrendering to the inevitable, releasing her grip on the miracle they'd fought so hard for. "I love you," he managed to say, but the words caught in his throat, and he wasn't sure if she heard him before they rolled her away, down the corridor toward the surgical wing, toward an outcome no one could predict. Marcus stood frozen in the hallway, watching until his wife disappeared around the corner, leaving him alone with nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat and the fluorescent hum of hospital lights. Down the hall, Naomi Graham watched it all unfold with a feeling of helplessness so profound it felt physical. She'd been pacing for the past 10 minutes, her mind racing through everything she knew, everything her grandmother had taught her, everything she'd seen work in situations exactly like this one. She tried to speak up and been dismissed. She tried to offer help and been told to step back. And now she was watching a woman being wheeled to surgery for a procedure that might not be necessary, that might cost Victoria and her babies everything. All because the people with authority had stopped listening to anything except their own protocols and panic. She wanted to pray but didn't know what to say, wanted to do something but had no power, no voice, no standing in this place where titles and years of experience meant everything and instinct meant nothing. Her feet carried her almost unconsciously away from the delivery wing, through the staff corridors, toward the break room and the small locker that held her few personal belongings. Remember that photo in Naomi's locker? The one of her grandmother delivering a baby in that small Louisiana home. The image she'd been looking at just an hour earlier when this entire nightmare began? There was something written on the back of that photograph, something she hadn't looked at in years, hadn't thought about since nursing school when she tucked the photo away like a talisman, a reminder of where she came from and why she'd chosen this impossible, beautiful, heartbreaking profession. And that faded inscription was about to become the most important thing in that hospital. Naomi's hands were steadier now as she opened her locker and pulled out the photograph. She'd looked at the image so many times she'd almost forgotten there was writing on the back, but when she turned it over, the words were there, written in her grandmother's careful, deliberate handwriting, the penmanship of someone who'd only gone to school through 6th grade, but who'd learned to write with the kind of precision usually reserved for important documents and sacred texts. The ink had faded to a soft brown, the paper yellowed at the edges, but the words were still legible, still carrying the weight of a lifetime of knowledge distilled into a single directive. Trust your hands. Trust the mother. Trust God. The body knows the way. Grandma Louise, 1982-inch. Naomi read the words once, twice, 3 times, her eyes blurring with tears that she refused to let fall. 1982. That was the year her grandmother had delivered the Williams twins in a cabin with no electricity during a summer storm that knocked out power across 3 parishes. Naomi's mother had told her the story 100 times, how Grandma Louise had stayed calm while lightning cracked the sky and rain hammered the tin roof, how she'd guided Mrs. Williams through 12 hours of labor with nothing but kerosene lamps and confidence, and those 4 principles written on the back of this photograph. Trust your hands, not the instruments, not the monitors, not the medical degrees, your hands. The hands that had touched 10,000 bellies, felt 10,000 contractions, guided 10,000 babies into the light. Trust the mother, not the protocols, not the statistics, not the fear, the mother. The woman whose body had grown this life, whose instincts ran deeper than any textbook could map. Trust God, or fate, or nature, or whatever force had been bringing babies into the world since the beginning of human existence, long before hospitals and surgical teams and consent forms. The body knows the way. This was the foundation of everything Grandma Louise had taught her. The body, not broken, not failing, not in need of rescue, but wise, capable, designed for this very purpose if only given the chance, the support, the trust to do what it knew how to do. Naomi pressed the photograph against her chest, closed her eyes, and felt something shift inside her. Not confidence, exactly. She was still terrified, still aware of how young she was, how new, how utterly without authority or credibility in this place. But something stronger than confidence, something closer to certainty. The kind of knowing that doesn't come from textbooks or training, but from blood and bone and generations of women who'd done this work in kitchens and bedrooms and fields, who trusted their hands and the mothers and God and the body's ancient wisdom. She opened her eyes, tucked the photograph carefully back into her locker, and turned toward the surgical wing. She didn't know yet what she was going to do or how she was going to do it. But she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she couldn't let this surgery happen. Not when there was still another way. Not when Victoria's body might still know the way. If only someone would help her listen. The corridor leading to the surgical wing was wide and sterile, designed for the efficient transport of gurneys and equipment, and in that moment it felt like the longest hallway in the world. The surgical team moved with practiced urgency, Victoria's gurney rolling steadily toward the double doors that would take her to an operating room already being prepped, instruments laid out in precise rows, anesthesiologist reviewing dosages, everyone playing their assigned role in a procedure that had become inevitable. And then Naomi Graham stepped directly into their path. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it, didn't consider the consequences. She simply moved on instinct, her body acting before her mind could talk her out of it, placing herself squarely in front of the gurney with her hands raised, not in aggression, but in plea. The gurney stopped so abruptly that one of the nurses had to brace herself to avoid collision. Gasps rippled through the staff. Audible, shocked, the kind of sound people make when someone breaks an unspoken rule so fundamental that the violation itself seems almost violent. Dr. Morrison's face transformed from focused concentration to something darker, a flash of anger barely contained beneath professional composure. "Nurse Graham," he said, his voice low and sharp, each word clipped with authority, "step aside." Immediately, Naomi's voice trembled when she spoke, her words fighting their way past fear and doubt and the crushing weight of every eye now fixed on her. "Please," she said, and she hated how small she sounded, how young, but she pushed forward anyway. "Give me 20 minutes. I can deliver these babies naturally." For a moment, silence. And then, laughter. Actual laughter. It came first from Dr. Baptiste, a short, disbelieving bark of amusement, and then from one of the surgical nurses, a sound that might have been sympathetic under different circumstances, but in this moment felt cruel, dismissive, a reaction to something so absurd it could only be met with ridicule. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her face a mixture of frustration and something that might have been secondhand embarrassment. "You're a first-week nurse," she said, spacing out the words as if explaining something to a child who wasn't quite grasping reality. "You think you know better than 20 specialists? Than Dr. Morrison, who's been doing this for 30 years? Than me? Than everyone in this hospital who's been trying for 32 hours to save this woman and her babies?" This was the hero's test. The moment when every story reaches a crossroads and the protagonist has to decide whether to back down, to apologize, to step aside, and let the world continue on its predetermined path, or to stand firm, to believe in something that can't be proven, to risk everything on faith and instinct and knowledge that exists outside the boundaries of what's officially recognized as knowledge at all. Naomi felt the weight of that choice pressing down on her shoulders, felt her legs threatening to give way, felt every fiber of her being screaming at her to apologize, to move, to let the experts do what experts do. But she thought of her grandmother's words written on the back of that photograph. She thought of Victoria's whispered plea, "Please, not like this." She thought of 23 babies delivered without a single loss, not because of medical degrees, but because of trust, patience, and the willingness to listen to what the body was trying to say. "I've delivered 5 babies during nursing school," Naomi said, her voice stronger now, finding solid ground beneath the trembling. "All natural births. All successful. And I learned from women who delivered over 100 babies without a single loss. Not one." Dr. Morrison's face had gone from angry to something closer to disbelief edged with genuine concern. "This isn't some home birth, Graham. This is a high-risk twin delivery with fetal distress. 32 hours of failed labor. Dropping heart rates. Maternal exhaustion. You're not talking about helping some healthy 25-year-old have a baby in her living room. You're talking about a woman who could die, whose babies could die, and you think 20 minutes and some folk wisdom is going to fix what we couldn't fix with every resource modern medicine has to offer? You could kill them both. Do you understand that? You could kill them all." The silence that followed was deafening. It filled every corner of that corridor, pressed against eardrums, made breathing feel difficult. Staff members who'd been walking past stopped, drawn by the confrontation, by the unprecedented sight of a rookie nurse blocking a surgical team, by the tension so thick it seemed to have physical form. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone waited to see what would happen next, how this impossible standoff would resolve itself. And then, from the end of the hallway, a voice cut through the silence like a blade. Wait. Everyone turned. General Marcus Hale stood at the far end of the corridor, still wearing the civilian clothes he'd arrived in hours ago, his posture military straight despite the exhaustion and fear etched into every line of his face. He walked toward them slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his eyes locked not on the doctors, but on Naomi. When he reached her, he stopped, studied her face for a long moment, and asked the simplest, most devastating question anyone had asked all night. Have you done this before? Naomi met his eyes without flinching. Yes, sir. Not in a hospital. But yes. The general nodded slowly, processing this, and then asked the impossible question. The one that would determine everything that happened next, the one that required not medical knowledge, but something deeper, something that couldn't be taught in any school. If this was your wife, your children, would you trust yourself? Naomi didn't hesitate, didn't look away, didn't soften her answer with qualifications or uncertainty. With my life, sir. What the general did next would either save his family or destroy them, and he had 30 seconds to decide. 30 seconds to weigh the credibility of 20 specialists against the conviction in a young woman's eyes. 30 seconds to choose between what made sense on paper and what his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours, were screaming at him to trust. He turned to Dr. Morrison, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command, the tone of a man who'd made impossible decisions under impossible pressure and learned to live with the consequences. Give her 20 minutes. If it's not working, we go to surgery. The doctors erupted in protest, words tumbling over each other in a cascade of professional outrage. Liability. What about liability? Insurance protocols. Hospital policy. Medical board regulations. The risk to the patient. The risk to the babies. The risk to everyone's licenses and careers and the hospital's reputation. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his voice rising. General Hale, I understand you're frightened, but this is medically irresponsible. We can't let. I've made my decision. The general's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. It simply cut through every objection with the force of absolute authority. 20 minutes. And I take full responsibility for whatever happens. Now someone get me a consent form that says exactly that. The silence that followed was different from before. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of surrender, of people realizing that the decision had been made and no amount of protest was going to change it. Dr. Morrison's jaw tightened, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, but he gave a curt nod to the surgical team. Back to delivery room 3, he said, his voice tight. 20 minutes. But I'm staying in that room, and the moment those heart rates drop any further, we're going to surgery whether your 20 minutes are up or not. As they turned the gurney around, as the staff began moving back toward the delivery room with expressions ranging from disbelief to anger to something that might have been hope, one truth became crystal clear. The system had tried to silence Naomi Graham, had dismissed her, had laughed at her, had done everything possible to keep her in her assigned place. But in that corridor, with everything on the line, she'd found her voice. If you believe in trusting your instincts over status, if you've ever watched someone with less experience but more wisdom get dismissed by people who confuse credentials with competence, if you think courage matters more than titles, then understand that what happened in that hospital corridor was bigger than one nurse and one patient. It was a moment when the entire system got challenged, when someone had the audacity to say there's another way, even when everyone with authority said there wasn't. Don't let this story be silenced. Because what happens in the next 20 minutes will prove that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust what you know, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. The journey back to delivery room 3 felt like moving through water, every second stretched and heavy with the weight of what came next. They wheeled Victoria through corridors that had witnessed this same trip countless times, but never under circumstances quite like these. Never with a first-week nurse about to attempt something that 20 specialists had deemed impossible. Never with a general standing witness to a gamble that could cost him everything. Never with this particular collision of desperation and defiant hope hanging in the air like electricity before a storm. Naomi walked beside the gurney, her hand resting lightly on the rail, and felt something shifting inside her. The trembling that had plagued her hands earlier, the voice that had shaken with fear in the corridor, all of it was settling, finding solid ground. She moved to the scrub station just outside the delivery room and began the ritual of preparation, the warm water running over her hands and forearms, the antibacterial soap lathering between her fingers, the methodical counting that nurses learn in their first semester and repeat thousands of times until it becomes meditation, becomes prayer, becomes the bridge between the person you are in the world and the person you need to be in the room where life and death make their negotiations. Her hands were steady now, completely steady. Senior nurse Clara appeared beside her at the sink, scrubbing in with the same practiced movements, and leaned close enough that only Naomi could hear. "I hope you know what you're doing, honey," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not quite belief, but not dismissal either. Something closer to the way people talk when they're watching someone walk a tightrope and can't decide whether to hope they make it across or look away before they fall. Inside delivery room 3, the doctors had positioned themselves against the walls, arms crossed over their chests, faces arranged into expressions of professional skepticism. Dr. Morrison stood closest to the monitors, his eyes fixed on the screens displaying the baby's heart rates, ready to call the whole thing off at the first sign of deterioration. Dr. Chen leaned against the counter where instruments lay ready for emergency intervention. Dr. Baptiste checked his watch, a gesture that said louder than words, "Your 20 minutes start now, and we're counting every second." They were waiting for her to fail, not hoping for it exactly. These were doctors who dedicated their lives to saving patients, but certainly expecting it. Because in their experience, in their training, in everything they knew about obstetrics and high-risk deliveries and the cold hard statistics of what works and what doesn't, this shouldn't work. A rookie nurse with some folk wisdom in 20 minutes couldn't accomplish what they hadn't managed in 32 hours. It defied logic, defied protocol, defied everything their careers had taught them about how birth happens in modern medicine. But Naomi wasn't thinking about their skepticism or their crossed arms or the clock that had just started its countdown. She was thinking about Victoria, about the woman on that bed who'd waited 20 years for this moment and deserved better than surgery and separation and the cold efficiency of an operating room. She moved to Victoria's bedside, and instead of checking monitors or issuing instructions, she did something that hadn't happened in that delivery room all night. She spoke softly, gently, human to human, woman to woman. "Mrs. Hale," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper, leaning close so Victoria could hear her without strain. "I'm Naomi. I'm going to help you bring your boys home. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Victoria's eyes fluttered open, glazed with exhaustion and pain and something close to resignation. For a moment, she just stared at Naomi as if trying to place her, to understand who this young woman was and why her voice was different from all the others, why it didn't carry the edge of panic or the weight of defeat. And then, slowly, she nodded. Barely a movement, just the slightest inclination of her head, but it was enough. It was consent. It was surrender. It was trust. Naomi placed her hands on Victoria's abdomen, not checking monitors, not consulting readouts, but feeling, actually feeling, the way her grandmother had taught her. Her palms pressed gently against the taut skin, fingers spread wide, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, tuning out the beeping machines and the watching doctors and everything except the rhythm beneath her hands. She felt a contraction building, felt the wave of it moving through Victoria's body, felt the strength of it, the power. And she felt something else. Something the monitors couldn't show and the doctors hadn't noticed in all their examinations and interventions. Victoria's contractions were strong, incredibly strong, actually, exactly the kind of contractions that should be moving babies down the birth canal with efficient progress. But Victoria was fighting them. Every time a contraction began, she tensed her entire body, held her breath, bore down with all her remaining strength, but at the wrong angle, with the wrong timing, pushing against the wave instead of riding it. She was exhausted not because her body was failing, but because she'd been working against herself for hours, fighting the very process that was trying to bring her babies into the world. A memory flooded back, so vivid it felt like being transported through time. Naomi was 12 years old, standing in the corner of Mrs. Jackson's bedroom while her grandmother coached the woman through the final stages of labor. Mrs. Jackson had been pushing for an hour, getting more and more frustrated, more panicked, and finally she'd cried out, "I can't do this, Louise. I can't." And Grandma Louise had taken the woman's face in her weathered hands and said, "Don't fight the wave, baby. Ride it. Your body knows when." You just gotta listen. Stop trying to control it and let it lead you. The baby knows the way. Your body knows the way. You just gotta get out of their way and let them do what they've been knowing how to do since before you were even born. Mrs. Jackson had stopped fighting, had surrendered to the rhythm. And 20 minutes later, her daughter had entered the world with a cry that sounded like triumph. Naomi opened her eyes and looked at Victoria with the certainty of someone who'd just found the answer to a question everyone else had been asking wrong. "Victoria," she said, her voice firm now, but still gentle, still respectful of the woman's exhaustion and fear. "You're fighting your body. Stop trying to control it. Let it lead you. Your babies know the way. Your body knows the way. You just have to trust it." Dr. Morrison made a sound that might have been a scoff. "That's not medical." Naomi turned her head slightly, not leaving Victoria's side, but fixing Dr. Morrison with a look that carried every ounce of the certainty her grandmother had possessed, every bit of the authority that comes not from degrees, but from absolute knowing. "Respectfully, doctor," she said, her voice quiet but unmistakable in its firmness, "I need silence." The room went quiet. Completely, utterly quiet. Even the skeptics, even the doctors who'd been ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble, fell silent. Maybe it was the tone of Naomi's voice. Maybe it was the general standing in the corner, his presence a reminder that he'd given her authority for these 20 minutes. Or maybe it was something else, the recognition that they were witnessing something outside their usual protocols, something that required a different kind of attention, a different kind of respect. On the wall, the clock read 7:15 in the evening. The second hand swept around the face with relentless precision, each tick a reminder that time was not on anyone's side. 20 minutes. That's all she had. 20 minutes to prove that sometimes the oldest wisdom is the truest wisdom, that sometimes the body knows things that machines can't measure, that sometimes trust is more powerful than intervention. 20 minutes to bring 2 babies into the world, or to fail spectacularly in front of everyone who'd already decided she would. The countdown had begun. Naomi began with breath. Not the rapid, panicked panting that Victoria had been doing for hours, but the deep, intentional breathing her grandmother had taught her, the kind that connects a woman to her body's ancient rhythm, that turns pain into purpose, that transforms fear into focus. She coached Victoria through it, her voice low and steady, a metronome of calm in a room crackling with tension. "Breathe in through your nose, slow and deep. Hold it. Now let it out through your mouth, even slower. That's it. Again, feel your body. Don't fight it. Listen to what it's telling you." And then she did something that made every doctor in the room stiffen with confusion. She repositioned Victoria. Not flat on her back in the standard lithotomy position that had been used for hours, but on her side, one leg supported, her body curved in a way that opened her pelvis and worked with gravity instead of against it. The doctors exchanged glances but said nothing, honoring the silence Naomi had demanded, though their faces betrayed their skepticism. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how twin deliveries were managed in modern hospitals. But Naomi knew what she was doing. She'd watched her grandmother do this exact thing a dozen times, adjusting position based not on what a textbook said, but on what the woman's body needed, reading the signs that came from touch and observation rather than from screens and numbers. Minutes passed. Victoria's breathing steadied. Her contractions continued, strong and regular, but now she wasn't fighting them. She was riding them, the way Naomi had instructed, letting her body lead, trusting the process that had been bringing babies into the world since the beginning of human history. Outside the delivery room, General Marcus Hale stood at the window, watching every moment. His hands gripped the window frame so hard his knuckles had gone white, bloodless. He didn't blink, didn't look away. This was his wife, his children, his entire future balanced on the skill of a woman young enough to be his daughter, and all he could do was stand there and bear witness and pray to a God he'd stopped talking to years ago in a desert halfway around the world. 12 minutes in, something changed. Naomi felt it in her hands before she saw it. A shift, a movement, the first baby beginning his descent. She checked Victoria manually, her fingers gentle and certain, and felt the unmistakable pressure of a crowning head. "Victoria," she said, her voice carrying the first note of excitement she'd allowed herself since this began. "Your baby's coming. On the next contraction, I need you to push with your body, not against it. Let it carry you." Victoria pushed, and the baby's head emerged into Naomi's waiting hands. The doctors leaned in despite themselves, surprise flickering across their faces. This was working. Against all their expectations, against all their training, this was actually working. But then Naomi saw it, and her heart stopped. The umbilical cord was wrapped around baby A's shoulder, looped tight enough that one wrong pull, one moment of panic or improper technique, could compress it against the baby's neck and strangle him in the final seconds of birth. This was the complication every birth attendant feared. A nuchal cord in a position that made extraction dangerous, that required perfect precision and perfect calm and perfect timing. Dr. Morrison saw it at the same moment and stepped forward immediately, his voice sharp with authority. That's it. We need to. No. Naomi's voice cut through his, firm and absolute. I can do this. She remembered. God, she remembered. She was 9 years old, watching through a doorway her mother had told her not to cross, watching her grandmother deliver Mrs. Rodriguez's baby when the cord had wrapped not once but twice around the infant's neck and shoulder. She remembered the way Grandma Louise's hands had moved, slowly, carefully, with infinite patience, gently rotating the baby, easing the cord over the tiny shoulder with movements so precise they looked like prayer. Naomi whispered, so quietly only she could hear it, "Grandma, if you're watching, guide my hands." And then she worked. Her fingers found the cord, felt its tension, and with movements so gentle they seemed impossible given the urgency of the moment, she began to ease it free. She rotated the baby slightly, supported Victoria through another contraction without pulling, waited for the exact right moment, and then, with a movement that came from somewhere deeper than training, somewhere older than medicine, slipped the cord over the baby's shoulder and clear of danger. At 8:23 in the evening, baby A. Marcus Jr. entered the world screaming his lungs out, his cry filling the delivery room like an announcement, like a declaration, like proof that sometimes trust and patience and ancient wisdom can accomplish what technology and panic cannot. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the nurses pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Chin's expression had transformed from skepticism to something close to awe. Even Dr. Morrison, who'd been ready to shut this whole thing down, stood frozen, staring at the crying infant in Naomi's hands. But there was no time for celebration. No time to bask in victory or accept congratulations or even catch her breath. Because on the monitor behind them, baby B's heart rate was dropping. Fast. Dangerously fast. One baby saved. But the second twin was dying inside his mother. And Naomi had 4 minutes left. Baby B's heart rate plummeted on the monitor, the numbers dropping with terrifying speed. Alarms began to sound, piercing and insistent. Dr. Morrison's voice cut through the moment of celebration like a blade. C-section. Now, we're losing him. Naomi looked up from Marcus Jr., who was being quickly cleaned and assessed by a nurse, and felt ice flood her veins. She checked Victoria, felt the position of baby B, Thomas, and knew with absolute certainty what the problem was. He was there, right there, ready to be born, but Victoria had nothing left. She'd spent everything bringing his brother into the world. One more contraction, Naomi said, her voice steady despite the alarms screaming around her. Please, just one more. We don't have time for, Dr. Morrison began, but General Hale's voice rose from outside the window, loud enough to be heard through the glass. He was praying, actually praying out loud, words tumbling over each other in desperate petition to a God he hoped was listening. Naomi repositioned Victoria one final time, her hands applying gentle pressure to Victoria's abdomen, guiding, supporting, trying to help the exhausted woman's body do what it no longer had strength to do alone. But Victoria's eyes were closing, her consciousness slipping away from sheer exhaustion. I can't, Victoria whispered, barely audible. I can't do this. Naomi took Victoria's face in both her hands, leaned close until their foreheads nearly touched. Victoria, look at me. Your son needs you. One more push. You are strong enough. And then everything slowed down. The alarms faded into background noise. The doctor's urgent voices became distant. Time itself seemed to stretch and bend, creating space for something timeless to happen. Just breath, just heartbeat, just trust passing between two women in the most primal moment human beings ever experience. Victoria pushed. Naomi's hands, guided by generations of wisdom flowing through her like muscle memory she'd inherited from women she'd never met, eased baby B into the world with movements that felt less like technique and more like inevitability. At 8:27 in the evening, Thomas's cry filled delivery room 3. Silence. Complete, stunned silence. And then chaos. Beautiful, joyful chaos. Nurses openly crying. Dr. Chen covering her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Morrison standing motionless, staring at the scene before him as if trying to reconcile what he'd just witnessed with everything he thought he knew. Outside the window, General Marcus Hale collapsed against the frame, his body shaking with sobs. Grief transmuted into relief, fear transformed into gratitude so overwhelming it demanded physical expression. Victoria, barely conscious, held both her sons against her chest, and through tears looked at Naomi with an expression that transcended words. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." In 20 minutes, a rookie nurse did what 20 doctors couldn't. But the story doesn't end there. What happened next would change that hospital forever. The emergency meeting was called for 7 o'clock the following morning in the hospital's main conference room. Naomi had barely slept, running on adrenaline and the surreal awareness that she'd either saved her career or destroyed it in the span of 20 minutes. The administration sat at the head of the long table. The chief medical officer, the director of nursing, the hospital's attorney, and several department heads whose expressions ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Dr. Morrison spoke first, his voice measured but firm. What happened last night was a breach of protocol. Nurse Graham practiced beyond her scope, overrode the medical judgment of senior physicians, and exposed this hospital to tremendous liability. I'm recommending immediate termination and a formal review by the state nursing board. The words landed like stones. Naomi sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, trying to keep her face neutral even as her future crumbled before her. But then Dr. Chen stood, her chair scraping against the floor. She saved 3 lives. 3 lives we were about to lose. I was in that room. I watched what she did. And I'm telling you, what we witnessed wasn't recklessness. It was skill we should have been using all along. The room erupted in argument. Voices overlapping, accusations flying. Some doctors defending Naomi, while others called for consequences that would ensure nothing like this ever happened again. The chaos continued until the door opened and General Marcus Hale walked in, uninvited, his military bearing commanding immediate silence. "I believe I have something relevant to this discussion," he said. The hospital's security director had reviewed the footage at the general's request. What they saw made everyone in that conference room lean forward. Naomi's technique, captured from multiple angles. Her calm under impossible pressure. The innovative positioning that worked with Victoria's body instead of against it. And most importantly, the results. 2 healthy babies and a mother who'd walked out of that hospital 48 hours later, whole and grateful. The chief medical officer watched the footage twice, then turned to Naomi with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We're not firing you, Ms. Graham. We're promoting you. We want you to help us develop a traditional birth practices training program. You'll teach other nurses and doctors the techniques your grandmother taught you." Naomi felt the room spin. "I'm not an expert. I'm just..." General Hale's voice cut through her protest. "You're exactly what medicine needs. Someone who remembers that patients aren't just bodies, they're people." The system tried to silence her. Arrogance tried to stop her. But talent, skill, and courage refused to be dismissed. If you can't stand people being judged by their title instead of their ability, if you believe wisdom matters more than credentials, comment, trust your instincts right now. 6 weeks later, Naomi stood at the front of a hospital conference room facing 30 healthcare professionals. Nurses, residents, and senior physicians who'd spent decades in obstetrics. Among them sat Dr. Raymond Morrison, his arms no longer crossed in skepticism but resting on the table, a notebook open before him. His expression transformed from dismissal to something resembling humility. Naomi taught them what her grandmother had taught her, not with PowerPoints or medical jargon, but with demonstration and story. She showed them the traditional positioning techniques. Lateral positioning that worked with gravity, supported squatting that opened the pelvis, hands-on guidance that read a woman's body like a language most had forgotten how to speak. She taught them breathing patterns that synchronized with contractions instead of fighting them. And most importantly, she taught them patience, the the willingness to trust a woman's body, to wait, to support rather than intervene at the first sign of difficulty. The room was silent except for her voice and the scratch of pens on paper as doctors who delivered thousands of babies took notes like first-year students. After the session ended, Dr. Morrison approached her slowly, almost hesitantly. "Nurse Graham." "Naomi," he said, her first name sounding unfamiliar in his mouth, as if he were learning a new language. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong. About you, about what you knew, about what was possible. Thank you for teaching an old dog new tricks." The words cost him something, pride, perhaps, or the comfortable certainty that comes from believing you already know everything worth knowing. But he offered them anyway, and Naomi accepted them with grace. The ripple effect spread faster than anyone anticipated. Other hospitals heard about the Louisiana method, Naomi's integration of traditional birth practices with modern medical care. She was invited to speak at nursing conferences across the South, then nationally. Her presentations always began the same way, with a photograph of her grandmother and the simple acknowledgement that she was merely passing on wisdom that belonged to generations of women who'd been bringing babies into the world long before hospitals existed. At St. Catherine's Hospital, the statistics told their own story. C-section rates dropped by 18% over 6 months. Patient satisfaction scores soared. More importantly, women reported feeling heard, supported, empowered in their births rather than managed through them. 3 months after that impossible night, Victoria and General Hale brought Marcus Jr. and Thomas to visit Naomi at the hospital. The twins were thriving, healthy, alert, already showing distinct personalities. Victoria held Naomi's hands and said words that would stay with her forever. "You gave me my miracle. And you taught me that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most wisdom." On a quiet Sunday morning, Naomi drove the hour and 20 minutes back to her grandmother's small Louisiana town. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking land that had belonged to her family for 5 generations, headstones weathered by time and rain and the relentless Louisiana sun. She found her grandmother's grave beneath an old oak tree, the marker simple and dignified. Louise Marie Graham, 1932 to 2018, beloved mother, grandmother, midwife. Naomi laid fresh flowers, Louisiana irises, her grandmother's favorite, and knelt in the grass. "Thank you for teaching me," she whispered to the stone, to the memory, to whatever essence of her grandmother might still linger in this place. "Thank you for trusting me." She remembered being 8 years old, watching those weathered hands catch a newborn in candlelight. Remembered being 12, allowed to help for the first time, feeling the sacred weight of a life passing from one world to another through her palms. Remembered her grandmother's voice, patient and certain. "You got the gift, baby. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Now, at 26, Naomi supervised 3 new nurses at St. Catherine's, passing on the tradition exactly as it had been passed to her. Not through textbooks or formal lectures, but through presence, demonstration, and the gradual building of confidence that comes from witnessing wisdom work. One evening, a student named Jennifer faced a difficult delivery. The patient had been laboring for 18 hours, and the senior doctors were suggesting intervention. Jennifer looked at Naomi across the delivery room, her eyes wide with uncertainty and the specific fear that comes from knowing you might have the answer, but being terrified you're wrong. Naomi gave her the same steady look General Hale had given her that impossible night. "Do you trust yourself?" Jennifer hesitated, then nodded. "Then trust the mother. Trust the body." 20 minutes. Jennifer succeeded. Guided the mother through repositioning and breathing, supported her with patience instead of panic, and 23 minutes later caught a healthy baby girl whose first cries sounded like vindication. That night, Naomi didn't just deliver 2 babies in a moment of crisis. She delivered a movement, a quiet revolution happening in delivery rooms across the country where healthcare providers were remembering that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in a textbook or a surgical suite. It's found in a heartbeat felt through fingertips, in hands that know how to listen, in a voice that says with absolute certainty, "I believe in you. Your body knows the way, and I'm here to help you trust it." 3 years after that impossible night, Naomi Graham's nameplate read, Director of Maternal Care, St. Catherine's Hospital. She was 28 years old, the youngest person ever to hold the position, leading a department that had become a model for hospitals across the region. Her office held the photograph of her grandmother in a place of honor on the desk, a daily reminder of where true wisdom comes from. The Louisiana method, as it came to be called, was now taught in 47 hospitals across the South. What began as one nurse's desperate gamble in a single delivery room had grown into a formalized approach that integrated traditional birth practices with modern medical care. Training programs included hands-on instruction in positioning techniques, breathing coaching, and, perhaps most importantly, the art of patient listening that had been lost somewhere between medical school and clinical practice. Marcus Jr. and Thomas Hale had just celebrated their third birthday with a party that filled the general's backyard with laughter and chaos. Naomi attended, watching the twins chase each other around the garden, healthy and bright, and completely unaware that their entrance into this world had changed the course of modern obstetrics. They called her Miss Naomi and climbed into her lap to show her their birthday trucks and dinosaurs, and she held them with the same gentle certainty her hands had held them on the night of their birth. Dr. Raymond Morrison now co-taught the Traditional Birth Practices Certification Program with Naomi. The partnership had been awkward at first, the senior physician who'd wanted her fired now learning from the rookie he'd dismissed, but it had evolved into genuine collaboration. Morrison brought decades of medical knowledge. Naomi brought wisdom that predated modern medicine. Together, they were training a new generation of providers who understood that the best care happens when both sources of knowledge work together. General Marcus Hale had established the Louise Marie Graham Scholarship for nursing students from underserved communities, funded generously enough to provide full tuition, books, and living expenses for 10 students each year. The first recipients were already in their clinical rotations, carrying forward the tradition of women who'd learned to deliver babies in homes where hospital care was a luxury no one could afford. Newspaper headlines told the story in stark print. Nurses' traditional methods revolutionized maternity care. Hospital C-section rates plummet after implementing Louisiana method. From rookie to revolutionary. How one nurse changed birth in America. But for Naomi, the real story wasn't in the headlines or the statistics or even the title on her office door. It was in the quiet moments. In delivery rooms where women felt heard, where their bodies were trusted, where the ancient dance of birth was honored rather than managed into submission. Naomi sits in her office at St. Catherine's Hospital, the afternoon light streaming through the window behind her, softening the edges of a woman who's lived more in 3 years than most people live in decades. When asked about that night, the night that changed everything, she pauses, choosing her words carefully, the way people do when they're trying to honor a truth too big for simple telling. People ask me how I stayed so calm that night, she says, her voice quiet but steady. The truth is, I wasn't calm. I was terrified. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing so fast I thought everyone could hear it. I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I fail? What if I cost this woman everything? She pauses, her eyes distant with memory. But my grandmother taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's trusting yourself even when you're shaking. It's believing in what you know even when everyone with more credentials and more experience is telling you you're wrong. She picks up the faded photograph from her desk, runs her thumb across the image with the tenderness reserved for sacred things. That night, I didn't save Victoria. She saved herself. Her body knew exactly what to do. I just reminded her to listen to it. I just helped her remember that women have been doing this since the beginning of time, and all the technology and protocols in the world can't replace the wisdom that's written into our very bones. This is what happens when we listen, when we trust, when we remember that the most powerful force in any hospital isn't the latest technology or the most prestigious degrees, it's the human touch. It's the willingness to see patients not as problems to be solved, but as people with their own wisdom, their own strength, their own knowledge of what their bodies need. This is the true story of Naomi Graham, the rookie nurse who changed everything by refusing to forget what her grandmother taught her in a small Louisiana home where miracles happened without monitors or medical degrees, just hands, hearts, and trust. If this story moved you, if you believe in people who fight for what's right even when everyone doubts them, hit that subscribe button and comment, trust your instincts. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been dismissed, underestimated, told they don't know enough to trust themselves. Because stories like Naomi's deserve to be heard and remembered. They deserve to inspire the next generation of people who'll stand up when everyone tells them to sit down, who'll speak when everyone tells them to be quiet, who'll trust their hands and their hearts even when the whole world says they're wrong. And if you want to hear more stories of everyday heroes who changed everything, check out the video appearing on your screen right now.